function, and we'd be happy to address them for you. And with that, super excited to welcome Jonas Klink today. He's currently the head of product and design at Thrive Market. Don't want to steal too much of his thunder, but has a really great background and experience in testing and high volume environments. So excited to talk about that today. And with that, I'll hand it over, Jonas.
Thank you. And I'll dive in a second, but really excited to be here. This is an area I'm personally very passionate about. A little bit about myself before we kind of dive into the presentation. So I come from mostly a big company background, but it feels like it was half a lifetime ago. So I started my journey as a computer science background in software development with Google, moved over to technical product management while at Google, and then did a long stint with eBay, but more kind of business and customer-centric product management. Did a move over to viajet.com. That was a startup that Walmart had acquired at the time, and then did some good fun work on the mothership of Walmart e-commerce. And then at that time, when I had been doing then, worked for Google, and then the biggest marketplace in the world, and then the biggest retailer in the world, I felt like it was time to do something that was maybe a little bit smaller and a little bit more mission centric. So there are two things I care a lot about. That's health and wellness, as well as sustainability in the environment. I am that weird guy who comes back from walking the dogs with a handful of recycling and trash. And so I spent some time with WW leaning into the health and wellness part of my interest, but then when this role where I'm now with Thrive Market came about, where the mission is really focused on making both healthy and sustainable living easy and affordable for everyone. It was too good of an opportunity to pass up. And the other thing was, I was also really the co-founders. They were really looking for someone who could put together kind of the way product management was done for Thrive, largely from scratch. So I was given an opportunity to do everything I've been dying to do. I'm kind of a self-professed nerd when it comes to product management. In general, I just find it fascinating that this area has been around for decades now, and at least within tech, but also many other industries, it's very central. And yet, those of us who are in this area, we don't graduate PMs still to this day, right? I come from a technical background. Many have an MBA background in addition or instead, and you hear stories of anything in between. So the story of my own learning journey has been one of a lot of just absorbing information and putting it into practice. I have had a couple of good managers along the way, but most of it's just been kind of trial and error over the past almost 20 years. And I've tried to put together something that is easily digestible, and that also kind of borrows from both my own experience, but also from a lot of other great thinkers out there. And I've kind of been tinkering over the past 2 decades with, okay, here's another piece. How does that fit with what I already know works? And so my goal here for today is to kind of give my view of not just me coming in as yet another person saying like, oh, I have all the answers, this is the one way you have to do it, everyone else is wrong. What I'm about to cover today is actually quite the opposite. This is an amalgamation of a lot of different thinking coupled with my own experience, and I hope that you'll find it useful as something that's very practical, that you can put to use in your own organizations, if that makes sense for you. So I do really want to make sure that for those of you who might be excited about kind of this framework and the thinking, we'll have, as Will said, plenty of time towards the end. And I'm happy to flip back and go through some of the slides again and kind of dive in, because my goal would be, nothing would make me happier than if I helped at least one person on this call kind of gain some new ways of attacking some of the problems we're all addressing. So somewhat lengthy preamble, but just want to make sure that people know why I am here. So let's dive in. Cool. So this kind of talk is titled the 80-20 rule, but that's kind of just a part of the framework and the techniques that we'll go through, and I'll talk about why the 80-20 rule is important and why it's an integral part of the mindset. But just kind of diving in terms of why do we test, right? We've talked a lot about testing, but why do we test? From my perspective, there's largely three different reasons why at least my team does testing, right? So the first one is around learning and proving or disproving hypotheses. The second one is around banking, and there are many terms for this, right? But essentially, you have a goal, and the way you prove to your leadership that you reach this goal is that you have a set of A/B tests that have been statistically significant, that all adds up towards that goal, and you kind of bank each of those tests against that goal. It's a fairly common practice, at least in the worlds I've been living in. And then there's no harm testing, which can also be done as, reverse testing, back testing, whatever you want to call it. Typically, this is where you launch something at, let's say, maybe 90% traffic to enabled, and you do a 10% holdout to make sure that you're not causing any inadvertent effects, but you're fairly confident that this is the right thing to do. The main thing I want to focus on here today is the first one. I think this should be the priority. The most important thing from my perspective is kind of a concept of learning velocity, and we'll talk about that in a second. But the other things are tactical, banking towards a goal. I'm not a business person. When we move the goals, don't get me wrong, I am excited, but I'm really in it for the learnings, right? A good day for me is if I have learned something, whether it works or it didn't work, to help us prove or disprove a hypothesis. And I can put that in my little mental toolkit of having learned something new about our design target, right? That is the most valuable way to employ testing in my perspective. The other ones are kind of necessary, and in some cases necessary evil, in order to kind of make the world around us tick on the business side as well, right? But we'll talk mostly about number one today. So I mentioned the concept of learning velocity. So learning velocity overall, this is not something earth-shattering, but it's something that's really, really important in the way that I'm kind of approaching stuff. And overall, it's really the rate at which we can move things from being just an idea to being validated as a either partial or even in some cases full solution to address a problem that we've chosen to focus on at the time. And there's a lot of research out there that is looking at learning velocity, and one of the key concepts there is thinking about the win rate or the batting average. And why is learning velocity important? Well, the key really sits with the win rate. So when you look at the research, typically your win rate, which is out of a set of ideas, and let's say 3 of them, typically the sweet spot when you look at the research is that a team that understands their design targets, their addressable market, and their problems really, really well, typically succeed with about 1 out of 3 of their ideas. And oftentimes it's given as a range. So teams that are early on that haven't yet dug in fully to really understand the design targets and the problems that they're facing might have as low of a win rate of as well 1 out of 10 ideas. And then on the other end of the spectrum, maybe you can succeed and go further. But typically the way we kind of talk about it is that 1 out of 3 ideas end up being something that partially or fully solves the intended problem. And typically, of course, unless maybe you're kind of the late great Steve Jobs reincarnated, where you can go up on a stage and say, hey, I'm here to tell you all about a problem you didn't know you had. And I also, by the way, have the solution, namely the iPhone in that particular example. Unless that's you, the mere mortals like myself and the rest of us, right? We typically don't know upfront which ideas are going to work. And I call those wins, and the ones that are not going to. And I call those learnings. Why do I call them wins and learnings and not wins and losses? Well, from my perspective, the only way to lose when you do testing is if you didn't learn anything, right? Because a learning is still a win, right? It may just not have solved the problem, but now you know more than you did before in terms of what the solution space actually looks like, right? So that's part of the culture I've tried to establish within my team, to think of these as wins and learnings, and just take really great care. Because again, the only way to have a failed test is if you construct it in such a way that you cannot conclusively say that you learned something from it that you can build upon going forward. So really then what it comes down to is the rate at which you can generate and validate these ideas becomes the most critical part in my book to keep an eye on, as long as you're also tracking your win rate and you're staying kind of in that sweet spot around, like, let's say 30%, right? So doing that, having a framework for generating and validating ideas with as little overhead as possible becomes the absolute most critical part in terms of how we operate. And so Will was kind of enticing me to give some examples here in terms of things we've talked about. So this slide has successes or failures. We should really call it wins and learnings. But there are in a world where we're doing as high velocity testing as we do, some of the most interesting learnings goes from not just was there an hypothesis that we put to the test that improved our scenarios and gave us more solutions that are moving the metrics that we're looking at. But some of the most fundamental tests and some of the most fundamental learnings that we have really have informed us needing to do a pivot in terms of the strategy we're doing overall. So when we're talking about learnings, there are tons of learnings, tons of tests that we've done all the time, right, where we've determined that things here at Thrive, for instance, that have worked really, really well at Walmart and at eBay when I was there, such as driving a sense of urgency and highlighting certain items in our catalog, it just doesn't translate to a company like Thrive, where the catalog is a lot smaller, right? At eBay, we're talking about 1 billion items, many of them duplicates of each other, right? Given the transient nature of their inventory. At Walmart, at the time I was there, it was about 6.57 million items were listed online. So the kind of tests that I came in with a bag full of successful ones from those scenarios, when we put those to the tests here at Thrive, it turned out that it didn't actually move the needle at all, because it's just a different problem space where we're talking about, right? Whereas on the success side, in terms of the win side, a lot of the testing that we've done to reduce the friction in our pre-paywall funnel on the member growth side have been incredibly successful. And so velocity not only is important for learning, but it's become an extremely lucrative vehicle for us to essentially just generate wins almost on a weekly basis that are translating to very real wins in terms of the membership conversion funnel year over year, about 25% lift year over year, right? So in some areas, the tests will give you learnings that will help you determine if a solution is working or not. In other areas, like my example around discovery and some of these conversion drivers, it can drive wholesale strategy pivoting. So doing testing, doing so in a disciplined manner, and getting to learnings fast can not only be extremely impactful on your ability to learn and drive business results, but also very quickly allow you to pivot from a strategy perspective. And so how does the testing fit into the big picture, right? So there's a lot of things that we're all kind of dealing with here around, there's OKRs and there's backlogs and there's strategy and there's vision and there's mission and KPIs and various focus areas. So over time, and I found this fascinating as I've dug into the literature and just understanding different concepts, a lot of blog posts and books and so on I read will focus on a very specific thing and say, okay, this is how you do product strategy really well. This is how you do testing really well. This is how you come up with an amazing and really compelling product vision. What I've tried to do is, over time, to kind of fit them all together into a jigsaw puzzle, where I feel like it makes sense in terms of how do all of these pieces fit together, and specifically, where does the testing fit into the big picture? So let me talk through what I mean in particular. So at the highest level and kind of the planning side of things, you have the mission, right? Thrive's mission: make healthy living easy and affordable for everyone. Under that, you have your vision. And the product vision, the way I look at it, is roughly what we plan to cover in the next 2 to 3 years, roughly. It will inform what do we do and why to bring us closer to our mission, right? The mission is the true North Star. Is Thrive ever going to make healthy living easy and affordable for everyone? Well, we're sure as heck going to try. But the everyone part is probably not achievable, right? To billions of people out there, very hard to make habit change happen and make it sticky, right? But we're going to try. And if you truly want to be a mission-driven company, your product vision should concretely show you how you intend to make progress over the next 2 to 3 years, and it should come hand in hand with some level of scorecard, right? Otherwise, you can't really with a straight face claim to be mission driven, right? Because then it's just kind of fancy words on the wall if you don't treat progress as something that's measurable. So underneath the vision sits the strategy, which is the progress we intend to make in the next 12 months. And how are we going to measure success and show that we're not just making progress towards the vision, but that the vision is actually working, right? And the mission doesn't really change. It's really a North Star, right? It's something that guides us, that we work towards, but we're never quite going to get there. The vision should rarely change, unless you need to have a pivot, right? But there should be something in your testing that would be a very good reason why you need to be updating your vision, right? The strategy could change more often. And then, of course, the next construct here, which are the priorities, typically as I guide my team towards focus on fewer things, 3 is not a hard and fast number, but it seems to be one that works fairly well in general. If you're focusing on 10 things, you're not focusing, because then you're focusing on everything. And by definition, you're not focusing, right? But these are the things that are most important in the next 12 months to execute on the strategy, listed in priority order. And the nice thing is that these priorities then can map really well into a framework like OKRs, right? So the three priorities can be translated into 3 objectives. And each of those, alongside kind of best practices on key results, can have 3 to 5 key results underneath them. So when we kind of dig in next in terms of the execution, the takeaway from this slide here is that the way I try to put everything into the big picture is that I want anyone who's working on any given priority, and we'll go deeper on the next slide, to be able to draw a straight line all the way up to the company's mission and say, we are working on this priority because it's part of the strategy in the following way, which helps us achieve the vision in the following way, which brings us closer to the mission in the following way, right? So it's really, really important for me that everyone has that straight line. But we'll go even deeper. So the big picture continues, right? So remember on the previous slide, I left off kind of on the objective side and the key results. And so continuing on that and drilling down even further, the way I think about it, right, is you have an objective. Let's say it's grow share of wallet. Let's say your key result is to improve certain aspects of the UX on the search and recommender side, maybe also some relevance and personalization to drive some sort of improvement in revenue per member by end of year. Those objectives and key results, right, then each come with a backlog, right? That backlog in our case is captured in Jira, in Epics. We can do that in a million different ways, of course, right? The most important part then is what's kind of under that purple line. What is it that make up the backlog? Well, it's really a set of hypotheses that each of them are tied to a particular problem, right? So the work that we do at Thrive really starts with the problem definition, right? So it's a usually fairly easy to articulate, well understood problem that's anchored in qualitative and quantitative data. And this is kind of, as you think about the art and the science to do testing well, this sits solidly in my book in the science part, right? Because the problem definition is fairly deterministic. Either you understand the problem well or you don't, Either you have data to showcase that this is a problem that, if solved, will help achieve the key result, or you don't have the data. And if you don't have the data, you go get it, right? So as a footnote, right, things that are not truly well understood problems, I usually just call them theories. And once we've kind of validated them with data, then we can solidify them as problem definitions. But that's really the most important part, because if you're solving the wrong problem, if you're solving a poorly understood problem, everything else downstream from there becomes largely irrelevant, because then now you've given up every chance to move your key result. Next step that's tied to the problem definition, and this goes in the vein of the art and the science part, sits more in the art part of the spectrum, because generating hypotheses is a bit of an art form, because once you are tackling a new problem, you're not going to have a great idea necessarily what the right solution is. So you want your team, a cross-functional team, the more the better, with different backgrounds, to generate hypotheses that are just enumerating the potential ways that you can partially or fully solve this particular problem. And you want to be very divergent early on, so that you're kind of wrapping your mind. And I always do this on Zoom, and it really doesn't translate well, but in my head, generating hypothesis is kind of like wrapping your arms around the solution space. And so you want to be intentionally kind of provocative and say, okay, what is a hypothesis over here? And what's another one over here and over here? Because then when you start your testing of these hypotheses, the goal initially, especially when you have a new problem, is to shrink the solution space down to a part that's more well understood, right? These hypotheses then, so as I said, in our case, each hypothesis lives in an epoch, one hypothesis per epoch, one problem definition per epoch. There could be there could be multiple epochs that have the same problem definition, but each epoch should be unique to a given hypothesis, right? Because you can, as I said, there's one problem, but there could be many different hypotheses of how to solve that given problem, right? And that's when the testing component comes in. So the main goal with the testing, as I said on the very first slide, is to prove or disprove those hypotheses. And this is kind of where the 80-20 rule comes in. And that is, what is the simplest test that we can run? Because early on, you're not looking to necessarily build out a full-fledged solution. And that's why I have the solution step to be separate from the prove and disprove test. So in some cases, maybe the solution is simple enough so you can build it out with all the bells and whistles, totally made for scale, all that good stuff, right? In most cases, however, doing all that work to build out a full-fledged solution is a waste of your time. Why is that? Well, if you go back to the math, right? So 1 out of 3 hypotheses end up being a partial or full solution. That's what the statistics are saying, which means 2 out of 3 of these hypotheses are going to be learnings only, but they're not actually going to solve the problem. So if you're always building out a full-fledged solution, in 67% of the time, you're wasting your time by building out the full-fledged solution, right? So this is now, between the art and science, you're back again in the art form, right? This is where your partnership with your tech team, your engineering team, becomes really, really important, because that little innocuous question of what is the simplest test that you can run becomes really hard, because you need to push yourself as a team to say, okay, let's make sure we're only changing the things needed to prove or disprove the hypothesis, but let's make sure we're also doing so in the most bare-bone way we can to make sure this is still a valid test, right? Because again, the test still has to be valid, still has to prove or disprove the hypothesis. Remember, that's the only way to fail on the testing side, if it doesn't actually prove or disprove it conclusively. But this is really, really important to make sure you're disciplined throughout kind of these steps in the processes, at least in my book, right? Because then once you find a solution and you feel confident now because you've run an A/B test, then you can always go back and build it out at scale. And this is where it requires some buy-in from the leadership side as well, because often if you have a successful A/B test and it's stat positive, and your CEO or someone else will be like, when are we launching this thing? And you have to say, well, we have to go back and build it out at scale. inevitably they're going to say, well, why didn't you build this out at scale? And this is why it's important that the companies bought into this and they understand the math of this. So yes, we might have been able to save some time for this particular test, but in the grand scheme of things, more often than not, you're wasting your time to build out full-fledged solution, especially when you're in the early stages of testing. So how do we prioritize what to test first, right? So you have a bunch of hypotheses, as I said, that might solve the particular problem. So there are many prioritization frameworks out there. I am particularly fond of rice scoring. The main reason is because it both forces you to leverage available data, and it also encourages a confidence conversation. So for those of you who haven't done rice scoring before, it's a pretty simple calculation. So you have your reach multiplied by the impact, multiplied by the confidence, divided by your effort. Voila, you have your rice score, right? Reach is just quite simply the audience size. So effectively, if you're making a change on your homepage, the reach is going to be really high. If you're making a change on kind of an obscure subpage somewhere, the reach is going to be very low. The reach can typically be calculated ahead of time, and that one's fairly deterministic. Then you have the kind of the pair of impact and confidence. They really go hand in hand, because impact is an estimate. It's a best guess, right? So for each customer that's exposed to the change, each customer that's part of the reach, what do we believe the impact is going to be? Is it minimal, low, medium, high, or even massive, right? So typically what we do there is that we kind of take a vote, and then we have a discussion of people who are outliers, and see if they're able to sway the rest of us, right? But really the impact, because it's a best guess, right, has to go with the confidence measure. And we like to use this confidence wheel. This is not mine. I borrowed it from a gentleman named Itamar Garlad, whose website is in there as well. Feel free to go off. He had lots of great thinking, both around rice scoring and other areas around testing. But the power of this is that it really it forces you to be honest in terms of what data do you have to back this up. And we do this even with pretty senior people within the company, right? Because when we do the rice scoring, we just put this confidence wheel up on the screen. And this is not to shame anyone, but it's also just to make sure that we're not just BSing the people around us. It's fine to say that this is just based on self-conviction. I think this is a really good idea. That's okay. But then the multiplier is going to be really low, right? Or maybe you have some surveys or competitive data. Okay, great. That is better. That is certainly not high confidence, but that puts you in the medium to low range, right? And the beauty of this kind of confidence wheel is that if you have an idea that has really high reach and you believe it could have really high impact, but your confidence in that is really low, then you can still say, okay, let's go off and build some more confidence, right? So if this is purely based on a pitch deck, let's at least do some very quick surveys or whatever have you. And all of a sudden now your rice score has moved up with fairly small and simple efforts, right? And then the last piece of this, effort, this is a relative scoring of total person weeks. Some cases, some of the teams do a more precise measure of person weeks, but it's really just more important to say, okay, if that thing is a 1, then this other thing is a 2, right? This is not t-shirt sizing, or certainly not grooming or story pointing. This is roughly to give us a very quick sense of this going to be hard or easy to do. So then kind of as you put all of these things together, going back one slide, you start with your problem definition, make sure it's well understood, and you have proper data to back it up. You get creative and generate a lot of fun hypotheses kind of early on. The more divergent, the better, so that you're really leaving no part of the hypothesis solution space unexplored. And then you need to be really disciplined and making sure that whatever you're changing as part of the test is only the things you need to prove or disprove the test, and that the test is as simple as built as possible. Because if you keep it simple and you move through these things very, very quickly, that's when you can really, truly achieve, really, really high learning velocity. So that was about it in terms of the things I wanted to cover. As I said, wanted to make sure that there was plenty of time after, Will, I'll hand it off to you, but then I'm happy to go into as much detail about all of this as people might be interested in.
Cool. Yeah, thanks, Jonas. And I'll make this super quick so we can get back into the questions as soon as possible. So yeah, today's webinar was brought to you by LogRocket. We are a AI first session replay and product analytics solution. So a couple ways that we help with A/B testing and experimentation generally. One would be to just come up with well-informed hypotheses by observing real user experiences. So with session replay, you can see exactly how a user interacts with your web or mobile application, and you might be able to draw some inferences from there as to what is introducing friction and what you might be able to tweak. Another is validating successful deployments. I know I've personally run a few tests on our homepage where I've accidentally just completely broken the hero banner, and it looks like the test is an epic failure, but it's actually not because it wasn't deployed correctly. And thankfully, we're able to identify that rather quickly. And then I think probably the most compelling here is being able to just dig a layer deeper. So we're going beyond kind of a binary, yes, did this work, or no, did it not? So kind of contributing to those learnings that Jonas mentioned, where you can maybe go in and see what it looks like for a user experiencing this variation and come up with some ideas about maybe why it worked or why it didn't work to move the needle in the way that you expected. And then with that, we can move on over to questions. So we have a question from Amanda who would like to know, do you have thoughts on using Rice at B2B companies, especially for reach and impact, since it's a situation where users who see a feature may not be the people who pay for the software? Is your impact at B2C usually related to revenue?
Yeah, the impact is a great question. The impact is customized based on the team's goal. So my member growth team is looking at net members in terms of impact or membership conversion. And then on the member engagement side, they are looking at revenue per member. So it's important for where there's teams that are doing the same type of work. We actually, under member engagement, we have 4 different teams sitting there. They're all using the same metrics for their impact scoring, because the beauty of that is that then you can also move things between backlogs. If we just ends up being the case that one of our teams has some really, really high scoring ideas, but they just don't have the bandwidth to go through all of them. And some of the others might have lower scoring ideas, right? So the main thing that's important is the teams that are working towards the same goal, that they're using the same metric, but you can really use any metric as long as you're consistent, right? So that your backlog is prioritized in the same way. So on the B2B front, the way I would look at that, right, is that ultimately the way you want to quantify the impact is based on the metric that you're looking to move, right? So if you're looking to move sales in a B2B world, then your impact should be in terms of the impact you have on sales, right? But if you are looking to move productivity beyond sales, like the end users within the new company, then you should use that metric, right? So the right scoring should really be tied to the metric you're looking to move, and you should prioritize it accordingly, right? If you're in a world where you're building features to help the sales team be successful and not the actual end users of those tools, then maybe that's a time to go find a different place to work, because it's at least from a product manager's perspective, I'm trying to help. My primary goal is to try to help the actual person that's going to use the product I'm building, not just the people who are responsible with selling it or buying it, right?
Cool. And then a question from Nikita. We are quite a small team and feels like sometimes the overhead of the framework like this takes longer for development. Are we doing it wrong?
I can't speak to that. I'm sure you're doing plenty of things right. But I think if I go back in terms of the framework kind of overall, there's some upfront work, especially on this part, right? Presumably, your company has a mission of some kind, right? The vision and the strategy does take some time, right? So if there's no vision and there's no strategy, that is an investment, and someone has to go do that work, right? I would argue that if that doesn't exist, that is a worthwhile time that is spent, because otherwise you're kind of flying blind, right? Then where your product is ending up is just a function of whatever tests end up being successful, right? If you're just trying to make the product better, so to speak, right? So I think it's time well spent, and this is solidly in the realm of leadership. Me as a VP of my company, I'm part of a mission-driven company, so the mission, it requires no work from me per se, but I spend a lot of my time keeping an eye on the vision and the strategy. That is a core part of my job. So like roughly 80% of my time is spent on the vision and the strategy and making sure that it's clear and it's sound and it incorporates learnings, and we're making changes as we need to, and that we're set up for success. And maybe 20% of my time is really focused on and executing on the priorities and tests against it. Now, once you get down to this piece, this is actually pretty cheap to implement. What we do, so we use Atlassian products and Slack, but you can really do this with any ones. But once you have an idea, we toss it in an Epic. We have a quick template for certain fields to go in there, but it really just comes down to just capture the idea, right? Just if you have an hypothesis of some kind, an idea, just make sure it goes in the backlog so it doesn't go away, right? Then when we write up the problem definition, that's typically just a paragraph that goes together with a set of hypotheses, which are typically just a sentence, right? Following kind of, if, then, because format, right? Again, this is just text, right? And this becomes a Slack post that goes in a channel that we call product briefs. And then we have a discussion as a team to make sure, okay, is this indeed a well understood problem that is crisply articulated? And does the hypothesis, the solution space that we've described feel exhaustive, or can we come up with additional ideas? And once we've aligned on that, then it's just kind of off to the races, right? Then it really comes down to, okay, let's Y-score your hypotheses. Let's pick the one with the highest Y-score, and let's figure out what is a really simple and really small test to do. So the piece, starting with problem definition, hypotheses, prove, disprove, and solution, this can be really, really fast. We cover a cycle of this in our member growth area within a week, and sometimes less. So you don't need a lot of people. And we're a small startup also. So our member growth team is literally 1 PM, 1 designer, and 2 engineers. That's it. And they're able to run at least 20 to 25 different cycles of these hypothesis tests in a quarter. And we're trying to get even faster. So this doesn't have to be expensive.
Cool, thanks for that. And then another question, when doing the RICE exercise, how do you know if the scope of any one item is right and not too wide or too narrow?
Yeah. So the scope is really determined by the hypothesis, right? So again, what you're RICing are the hypotheses. And the scope, and this is actually a really interesting thing to double click on, because it also helps with scope conversations. Because again, the tests you're running are meant to prove or disprove the hypothesis only, no more, no less, right? So there's no debates in this framework of like, oh, can we squeeze this in? Can we expand the scope? Can we fit this in? The answer is just no, right? It's either you're proving the hypothesis, either you have a test set up to prove the hypothesis, or you don't. You do not include anything else. Because as soon as you include something that is not needed to prove or disprove the hypothesis, then you risk of invalidating the test, right? Because I've seen numerous times where in my past, I haven't followed this rigorously, and you include some changes, and this is particularly important for the UX team because they might be in there and they're updating a page for this test, and they're like, all right, let me just tweak the fonts here and some of the margins, and oh, the page looks so much better now. And then the test comes back in an unexpected direction, and it's like, this doesn't make any sense. Was there a problem with the hypothesis or the 15 tiny things that we changed? Did they actually move the needle in a direction that we didn't expect it to? Now you have an actual failure because now you don't know, right? And you have to rerun the test, right? So you have to be really careful and really disciplined to set the scope to only what's needed to prove and disprove the hypothesis, right?
Cool. And then another one from Amanda. Should objectives and key results come from leadership at Thrive? Do PMs come up with their own and pitch them, or are they determined from leadership?
Yeah, so there's been an evolution in full transparency. So Thrive so I've been with right now for a year and a half. So this is the second year we're doing OKR in kind of a more proper way. Last year, it was very tops down as we were still kind of rolling out the processes and just evaluating talent on the team. This year and heading into also 2025, we're trying to do it the way kind of that it was intended, which is that there's a tops down component that meets the bottoms up planning. So there are kind of two parts to ultimately drawing up your backlog, right? So there's a joint conversation between leadership and the team that's executing in it to align around the what we're doing and why we're doing it. And then how we're doing it should be entirely in the domain of the team. And where I sit as the VP, I'm not part of the executive team, but I'm part of a lot of conversations. And I'm not an individual contributor, but I'm certainly part of that as well. It's my job to kind of straddle the two to make sure that bottoms up ideas and suggestions from people who are in the trenches and who knows the data and the challenges of the design targets really, really well are combined with the kind of the company-wide perspective of what are the important problems that we need to solve, what are the areas we need to invest in, where should we focus our problem solving such that we are meeting certain goals. In our case, we're a pre-IPO startup, right? A lot of it has to do with growth and profitability, right? Because that rings true in many other areas, right? If you've ever done a hackathon, for instance, it's great for a while if you'd make it totally blue sky, right? And people are super excited. Look at all my amazing ideas. We're going to do all these great things. But then once the presentations are over and you find that, okay, half of these ideas don't actually fit with what we're prioritizing as a company right now, and we just don't have enough people to go around to execute on all these great ideas. We have to focus on certain things. It becomes really demoralizing if people spent all this time being excited by ideas that go nowhere, right? So just as in the case with a hackathon, where I advocate to at least put a theme and say, these are the types of problems we're trying to hack around, just to make sure that the ideas can actually go somewhere, it becomes equally important that tops down and bottoms up component works together in conjunction, right? So that people feel like their voice is heard, but the ideation is channeled through the lens of the company's priorities overall.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Jonas. It looks like we got through all the questions and we're pretty much right on time. So awesome. I definitely learned quite a bit today. I'm excited to share this around with some folks in my network. I think there's a lot that we can learn from you. So thanks again.
Yeah. And if anyone wants to connect on LinkedIn, ask more questions, if this isn't obvious, I'm super passionate about these kind of things, and I'm also looking to continue to learn and refine this framework. So feel free to hit me up there, and we can keep the conversation going.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Jonas. Thanks to everyone for joining, and hope everyone has a great rest of your day and a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.